Welcome to the Estates Made Simple podcast. I'm Jenna Carvalho with Guardian Estate Company, and I'm here with co-host Gordon VanderLeek of VanderLeek Law. How are you today, Gordon?
Doing well, excited
Good.
for this next episode. I think an interesting one, and yeah, I'm looking forward to diving in.
Yes, yeah, me as well. As always, I enjoy our conversations. And before we get started, we obviously need to add a little disclaimer. So I'll let the legal expert do that.
Yeah, I wanted just to remind people that for the items we're talking about, this doesn't represent legal advice that requires a personal relationship and formalizing that relationship in writing to say, okay, now this represents legal advice. I think the items we talk about are hopefully useful information. How that applies to the estate you're involved with is specific to your situation, and so if you have the need for that, please feel free to reach out, and we can start that process. But with that caveat out of the way, let's get into the conversation about personal effects. In this situation, what's interesting about, if you look at the personal belongings, they take on a different almost composition or design. This is movable stuff, right? It's not like money in a bank account or land that you can find at land titles. So it makes it interesting, number one, to find all the property and where that is. But the reality is that we all accumulate a lot of stuff. Think of it this way for your own personal situation. If the house burned down, another lovely example of a difficult situation, but if the house burned down and you lost all your contents and you had to fill out an insurance claim form and say, well, I need to get reimbursement for the cost of replacing all these items, or what did I spend on these things? Number one, I think we would all conclude that that's a bigger number than what you think it might be. I bet if you
Mhm.
added it up and put it in a spreadsheet, you're going to go, whoa, there's a lot of stuff there, right? And because you just kind of discount, or you buy things a little bit over time, and over the course of a lifetime, you can accumulate a fair number of items. And so with that, I think they're not all, I mean, money is money. We know how to deal with that, right? We pay the taxes. Well, that can be calculated, but what do we do with the personal items? And then the other layer on it is that there's a lot of emotional baggage, if you will, or an emotional reaction attached to an inanimate object, right?
Yes.
We have that in our home. For my wife and I, our both sides of the family, parents have passed away, and we have some items that we collected from them as part of the distribution of personal belongings. And now, every time I look at a particular item, there was a clock I got from my father, and I remember him every single time I look at it. It's in my home office. I see it usually every day, and it brings in a memory. It brings in certain sentiments and
Mhm.
emotions. And one would look and say, well, that's just a clock. Well, for me, it's not just a clock. So
Mhm.
that, by way of background, is to say, when you are dealing with an estate as the legal representative, you got to deal with all those emotions, because it's not
Mhm.
the inanimate object that is devoid of an emotional response. Quite the opposite is that people will have a very strong reaction, a visceral reaction to something of very little worth. Um, there was a book written some years ago, and they used the example of the brooch that mom would wear every Christmas, and then it's like, who gets the brooch? But it was known to be, this was brought out and worn on the formal attire at special family events where everybody was together, and mom was hosting, if you will, right? So how do you divide that up? I mean, that's the other item. The things aren't divisible. Money in a bank account, well, okay, divide by the number of beneficiaries. That
Yeah.
can be calculated on a spreadsheet. Personal items can't. So it becomes one of the items that has to be dealt with immediately. Usually you have to clean out somebody's home. If they rented, the landlord wants to re-rent it. It's like, okay, you have a couple days to get it out. And if the family wants to sell the home of the parents, right, then you want to get it on the market. You got to stage it. You got to get it ready. So you got to deal with those personal items. So it's usually something that's dealt more immediately when the grief and the acknowledgement of the loss of the person having passed away is more palpable, right? It's stronger. So I think that makes it really difficult. It can be a challenging part of the executor's job to
Yeah.
navigate, to balance all those interests, deal with all the emotions, and deal with it in a way, in a timely manner, because of the pressure of having to deal with it. So I think it's an area which can be ripe for dissension and some strong feelings, and being able to navigate it, I think is challenging. And I think one of the reasons we wanted to have a podcast episode on it, to try to share some experience or look at some ways in which, how can you best deal with that. So how do you see, like, what are some of the first steps that an executor should consider when dealing with, the personal effects, the movable property, household items part of an estate, Jenna?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I will just add to your comment that when I was a professional executor, dealing with personal effects was often the most challenging process because, as you mentioned, there's so much sentiment and memories attached to so many items. So, it's good idea to follow a process and have a plan because, these items mean so much to the beneficiaries. And so the first step that we would, suggest you consider is really reviewing the will to see if there's any instructions that the deceased had left. Sometimes there might be a clause indicating a reference to a memorandum of personal effects, which is usually a 1 or 2 page handwritten document that may be placed with the will, indicating the deceased's wishes of where certain items are to be distributed. Now that memorandum isn't binding on the executor, but it does give the executor some guidance and maybe a voice from the grave of what to do. Sometimes there's a clause that says all personal effects should be sold and the proceeds added to the resident of the estate. Other times, the will asks the executor to offer it to beneficiaries in a way that they might agree. And if there's any dispute, then the executor can decide who gets what and how that division should be done, which is again where
Yep.
the conflict can arise and where the difficulty arises. That's primary start. Look at the will for instructions.
I
The
think
second
when you're,
step that oh,
sorry,
go
on
ahead.
that, just talking about the will, I think what's important, and it maybe touches more on the planning side, is I think ultimately you want to make sure that you have I think you're charged and have the discretion, but hopefully the will, if properly drafted, gives clarification to that role. So I think that helps establish the authority to be able to say, okay, I'm the one that's going to help to make some decisions about where things go. And certainly the will may contain specific gifts, like this person gets that item, right? So you
Yeah.
gotta, obviously, even if you come up with you have to follow those rules and then have proper documentation if you're doing something that's an alternative. And so making sure you're squarely within the four corners of the will would be important. And hopefully it gives you the necessary authority. So I just really wanted to emphasize that as well, to be able to know that. And the difficulty is often trying to find these instructions, right? You have to do a certain amount of due diligence. You can't rush too quickly into the process of distributing until you satisfied yourself that you've looked for and found any of those sorts of instructions. Otherwise you have to use your discretion to try to, figure out how best to distribute these items, which
Mhm.
as you've alluded to, can be an area ripe for dispute, right?
Mhm.
If more than one
Definitely.
person wants the same thing, how do you resolve that, right? So that's a difficult task. Sorry, I
Yeah.
wanted to add that point, but yeah, I think you were moving to your second point.
No, of course. Yeah. No, I like that. I like that point, and that will bring us into, if there is a dispute, what do you do? And so, starting point would be to get an appraisal done of the personal items. There's a number of individuals you can hire to come into the home, look around, decide and determine what is valuable, and place a dollar figure on that item. The sentimental value obviously won't be assessed, but the dollar figure will, and it gives you a basis of what you need to consider and what needs to be insured or how to divide on an equal monetary value between beneficiaries. It's just a nice starting point. So you have a list and it protects you. One of the beneficiaries might say, well, there was a valuable piece of art on the wall that went missing, or that isn't on the distribution plan. But if you have that appraisal, you can say, well, I've had the whole home assessed and it wasn't there, or it wasn't valuable, etc. So it just gives a nice point of reference.
Yeah. I think there are some companies around that also help and provide those services. So you can consider bringing in somebody who does this for a living to help with that process. Again, the introduction of somebody neutral and objective can assist to do, versus it's one of the family members ultimately making a decision over one of the, like if it's siblings, one of the siblings is one of the children surviving is the executor and having to make those final decisions over your sibling can lead to difficulties in the relationship. So that's where handling it well and coming up with a good process is really important. I've often thought, I remember seeing some of these invoices come in from companies that do this kind of work going, well, why would you have done that? Why can't you just do this yourself? But over the years, I've come to appreciate that they're probably doing a real valuable job, that maybe it's just taking the temperature down and somebody objective is dealing with it. I mean, arguably that may be one of the advantages of a trust company as well, is they're going to come in dispassionately and be able to set some rules for everybody, as opposed to just, one of the family members coming in. Right. So it makes it a little bit easier to be able to do that. I know I'm involved in a state right now where the deceased had getting back to the, making sure the instructions are there, had a detailed set of instructions regarding this person gets this and this person gets that. Makes it so much easier. People aren't fighting because it's like, well, we're just doing what this person wanted, as opposed to, well, how does everybody feel about this, right? So if you are looking at your own situation, saying, would it be beneficial to document your wishes or have a conversation as a family about how to reduce the tension and or mitigate any opportunity for fighting, because these are things that generally wouldn't end up in court because it wouldn't be worth it from a cost perspective in terms of the amounts that are there. But the cost of not doing it well is the lingering impact on the family relations, right? As a result of not doing this well, do you not talk to your siblings or other family members? I think for those that are planning their estates, those are the things they want to avoid, right? To make sure everything goes smoothly in that. So I really like the appraisal. If you look at areas where there could be risk, you look at some painting and maybe you go, you're not into art and you're going to go, what the heck is that? That doesn't, kind of ugly. Well, what if it's, a famous artist, and that painting's worth $60,000 and you have, you put it on Kijiji for $60. And now you're looking at the other end of a lawsuit saying you failed to get it appraised. So much like you just don't know what stuff is worth, you may have, and this is not your area of expertise, just get an appraisal. It's great protection. It's worth taking the time to slow things down to get that appraisal, just so you are sure of what is there, because it may be worth a lot. And then there's potentially a tax issue. If you've got artwork and it's disposed of, this is stuff the accountant is going to need to know in terms of how do you prepare it. And if you guess, maybe you're guessing wrong, right?
Yeah, and he needs to go on the grant application for the grant of probate as well. So there's lots of purposes for the initial appraisal.
I think a lot of people think of the appraisal, they think of, well, that's for real estate. So I guess the message would be, you can get personal items appraised. If there's specific artwork, find a gallery that is known and understands the nature of that, right? We all see these shows on TV from time, whether it's people are going into a storage locker and pulling out stuff and having it appraised and suddenly it's worth more than anyone would have thought, or the road show, oh, here's an antique item I got from Aunt Betty and it's worth, there's that look of shock when the appraiser comes in and says, well, this is what it's actually worth, right? The point being is you don't know. As the executor, you have an obligation to inquire. So I would say be curious and err on the side of making sure you have an appraisal, because that's your protection. You have a third party telling you this is what it's worth, because otherwise it's your judgment. And the protection is you relied on a formal appraisal. So it's good for a whole pile of reasons. Yeah, you've got to exercise the judgment to say which items are appraised and which are not. If it's costume jewelry, you might go, well, I'm not going to get that appraised. But if you got artwork going, well, I don't know. Let me do some research on the author. Let me talk to some art galleries or those that are professional that know about this and get those appraisals in place. Maybe a good bit of protection that you're going to have.
Yeah. And so once the executor does have the appraisal, then there's different options that they can decide in how to deal with the personal effects. And so what would be your recommendation once the executor has that appraisal, Gord?
I think what we see a lot of times is that the family gets together and just, through conversation, oh, do you want this? Do you want that? I guess point number one is take a look at where people are at, and you may have to use the technology like a Teams call or a Zoom call to say, let's get everybody together and decide what to do with it. So just in addition to the appraisal, just having even an inventory of what items are there may be useful. I think depending on the nature of what's in the estate and the amount of the personal belongings, again, that can be a fair bit of work, but a useful way to share information. Take a picture and share that for everybody to determine who wants what. Otherwise, there is no right or wrong in terms of the methodology. It's about coming up with something that works. I know. Well, let me share what we did in like for my dad's estate, and I thought it worked really well as one example of coming up with a system for dividing personal belongings. We did it in rounds. So everybody
Mhm.
had to write on a piece of paper in round one, what would you like? Which kind of forces you into saying, well, what's the most important thing I would want? Without saying something, and then maybe the opportunity for somebody else to go, oh, I want that. You had to, it was private. It was, so you wrote it down on a piece of paper. It went back to the one person who then said, oh, this person wants this person wants that. No, everybody wants something different as their first choice. Well, then write down your second choice, and so on. You go through. And when we did that, there was only, I think, 2 or 3 items where when myself and my 3 siblings wrote it down that somebody picked the same thing. So I thought that
Mm.
was an interesting way of doing it. I've also seen it sort of an auction style, that
Yeah.
it's almost like we put a value on each item, and then all the, you could bid, or you got like almost like monopoly money, and you could go and say, I put a bid in on this, and you develop a system where people can bid on the item that determines what their value is. And if they're prepared to use their allocation of resources, their predetermined amount of money, they can go and purchase items. So then it helps distinguish between what is perceived as being important or valuable and what is not, and avoids, can be an efficient way to be able to distribute those items. Or you pull straws, and then everybody, that person
Yeah.
goes first, and then a person goes second, and then a person goes third. I mean, it's random, right? Because you sort of pull a number out of the hat, or you get the short, you pull the stick, and is it the longest or the shortest, or flip a coin or something like that. I would say if you can develop a system that has an element of fairness to the system versus sort of luck, it's like, oh, you ended up with more than I did, right? And now you got these feelings of discontent. So if it can equalize as much as possible, recognizing what you're dealing with, right? So you have to do some analysis of the value of the items. You may not want to put, in the pool of items, other items that are of great value. You've got a coin collection or a stamp collection. Well, that may need to be appraised, and maybe that's
Mhm.
dealt with separately than the other mementos or items that are there. But if you do it well, everybody feels like they got a fair amount, and doesn't it avoids the disputes or consternation that can come about for not doing it properly, right? Or not
Right.
following good process. Do you have any
And
experiences yourself in terms of your work as a professional executor, that different methodologies that could be used for dividing up the personal items?
yeah, well, you've mentioned several. I would add to the list sending all the items to an independent auction,
Mm,
allowing the family to bid on it as well as outsiders, because that definitely, increases the value of an item if there are several bidders, but also puts the conflict outside of the home, and if a beneficiary wants it enough, they'll go to that auction and bid on the item. So that was one. And then I would say, as a general rule, though, have the beneficiaries as part of the process, and in developing the process, so that they all agree to the process beforehand.
yes.
Because I think if you just impose a process on them, some might think it's unfair. So if they're part of developing it, I think it does go a lot smoother.
Yeah, there's buy-in from all the parties to say, well,
Mhm.
this is a fair process. And even if the outcome is not what is less than ideal from their perspective, that if they've agreed to the process, hopefully then they can live with the result.
Right.
Yeah, that's very
And
important. And that's an excellent point to really confirm is, while there isn't, you have to do it this way, there's nothing in the Estate Administration Act that says, here's how you divide personal belongings. So you have to come up with that process, and really make sure people sign off on that, and
yeah.
agree to it before you proceed, and that they're not feeling pressured into it, that they're agreeing to it, because then the outcome is the outcome. They've agreed to the process.
Yeah. And once the items have been divided and everyone's received as part of the process what they're supposed to receive, it is also a good idea to at least consider getting all the beneficiaries to sign a release. And I know we talked about a release in the last episode with respect to your inheritance overall, but specifically with respect to the personal effects. If you are following a cumbersome process and there's lots of discussion and decisions to be made, I always like getting that release right up front when they're receiving their personal items. Just saying, yes, I agree to the process. I've received what I'm owed, and I release the executor from any further claims I have with respect to the personal effects. And I think that sets the stage for a successful administration going forward as well.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And obviously you got to look at the circumstances of each particular estate, but it's an option available to you, right? To say that they no longer have any interest in the estate. The point being that just because they're getting the personal items may say, well, there's, that's different than like real estate or investments and the savings account, right? It's the hard assets of the estate. So we kind of diminish its importance. But these are people who have an interest in the estate, right? So you want to make sure that you've dealt with that and they acknowledge that their interest in the estate is satisfied.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if it's not, that forms a potential claim that they have against you, going, you didn't honor their interest, you didn't do it properly. So a release can happen even on those non-financial items, which is important, right?
Yeah, and as you mentioned at the beginning too, personal items are often the first items to be distributed or dealt with. And so if you wait to get that release, until you do a distribution of cash, beneficiaries might forget about it. They might, not realize what happened. And so, keeping it top of mind, getting the sign release up front is nice to have.
So as we wrap up, I think we are reminded, and we've talked about, yeah, maybe an elevated importance, right? Maybe that hopefully by listening to this, we're not running, our listeners are not running roughshod over, oh, it's just the trinkets and it's the costume jewelry or, furniture and things like that, that while there may be smaller monetary value and everyone's eyeing the prize in terms of the real estate or the savings, the larger numbers, if you do the distribution of the personal belongings poorly, it could lead to the same amount of strife or dissension or legal problems or challenges to the executor. So it's important to do it well, also to preserve, if beneficiaries are family, which oftentimes they are, that it's done well. So there's a risk element to it. There's the potential to maintain family relations and address the emotional impact attached to those items, that if you can do that well, then you avoid those problems. So with that, yeah, thank you for listening. I think it's been an interesting discussion, highlighting for me and hopefully for our listeners the importance of doing this well. Thank you for listening in or watching us on the YouTube channel. We want to grow this message. We want to reach as many people as possible, and one of the ways to do that is for you to subscribe. That way you're not going to miss an episode. But it also brings it to the attention of others, or do share about it. Share the episode if you think there's somebody who can benefit. That would make us feel well that our message is getting out to more than just the two of us talking in front of a webcam. So thank you so much for that. The success of this podcast and the reward for the energy we put into the podcast is that it gets shared and it reaches as many people as possible. And we appreciate any effort you can give us to that end. So with that, we'll wrap up this interesting discussion and look forward to our next time together. So until then, stay safe. Thank you for supporting Estates Made Simple.
Thanks, Gordon.